Hi folks, and welcome to our video lesson on Andre Bazin's Ontology of the Photographic Image. Here we're going to go over some of the key ideas of this brief but really influential essay. So who's Andre Bazin? He is a famous film theorist and film critic. He was born in 1918, died young, 1958. He's associated with realist film theory. What is realist film theory? It's basically a camp of film theorists who privilege this idea that film has a tie or a connection to material reality, and privilege films that seem to harness that relationship. So he's considered the most important French critic after World War II, one of the most important critics ever. He wrote tons, around 2,500 articles about film and TV, the bulk of which were not translated or collected. He was also instrumental in founding Cahiers du Cinéma, which is a very, very famous and influential French film journal. The Ontology of the Photographic Image was written in 1945, and it's one of his early texts. What about the title? The Ontology of the Photographic Image. I think we know what a photographic image is, but we might be unfamiliar with this word ontologies. It's a word that comes from philosophy. We don't have to go too much into it, but you can just think of it here as meaning, say, the essence of, right? The essence of the photographic image, or the nature of the photographic image. We will get to a kind of another definition of that term once we find the use of the word in the body of the essay. But for now, you can consider it to mean, what is the essence of the photographic image? In other words, you could translate the title as asking a simple question. What kind of image is a photographic image? Implicitly saying, what kind of image is a photographic image as distinct from other kinds of images, say painted images? So I'm going to summarize the first three sections of the text. It's a nice text to organize into chunks. As you'll see, it has different sections, and they're marked off as such. So it's actually a really nice essay to work through different chunks. I'm going to summarize the first three. So in the beginning, he'll say, the visual arts share a psychological motivation with embalming. Both preserve bodies from the ravages of time. So you might kind of pose the opening lines as a puzzle. What do visual arts have to do with mummies, right? He talks about mummies, embalming. And he says that both are preserving human bodies from the ravages of time. That is, from the ravages of decay. That is a function of a body's existence decaying over time. He thinks that there is this almost universal psychological motivation to make pictures of people so that those pictures last longer than the body does. That's a kind of grand claim to make. Before photography, he'll say, all visual arts followed this motivation. This created an uneasy split between, on the one hand, the psychological desire for representation, and on the other, aesthetic aims. So he wants to make a distinction between this deeply ingrained psychological desire to, say, preserve the things that you depict by depicting them, and those other aims of art which we consider artistic or aesthetic. But the importance is that he's trying to say that there's this other, less talked about ambition for the visual arts, which is not about, say, creating art to communicate something about history, communicating art or making art to express one's beliefs about the world, making art to give objects of beauty. He's saying there's something about preservation that has to do with the fact that things die and decay and that we want to depict them and save them, preserve them. He'll say the arrival of photography has freed painting from this predicament. Abstract art was able to arrive because photography had taken over the function of realism resemblance. Do you see the idea here? Why might the arrival of photography free painting from this predicament? Well, the idea is that photographs are really, really good at depicting the likeness of things. It's so easy to do. You don't have to be a talented photographer at all to create an image that looks a lot like the thing that you're trying to, say, preserve, right? So if you have this new technology that can easily reproduce the likeness of something, therefore that ambition, that is reproducing the likeness of something, might disappear from the other arts. Maybe it will free painting to do other things other than reproduce the likeness of things. So let's go into this idea. He says that you can track a general trend in painting to say that there's an increased emphasis on resemblance. And of course, what Bazin is doing is he's not really being an art historian. He's giving a kind of general claim about trends in art history, mostly to make an argument. Those of you who study art history might say, this seems too reductive. It is reductive. Reductive in order to say something profound about the medium of photography. But let's at least give him some credit and elaborate on what he's saying. So he's basically saying, if you look at the general trend in art, let's start with cave paintings, move on to pre-Renaissance, medieval art, then move on to the Renaissance, and then move on to, say, 18th century. You're getting a steady increase toward perceptual realism. Pre-Renaissance medieval art is known for being very flat and also not adhering to the rules of perspective. Perspective and chiaroscuro lighting effects get developed in the Renaissance, and then even stronger codes of pictorial realism get established and entrenched in what's known as academic painting, the 18th and early 19th centuries. What happens when photography comes on the scene in the 19th century? Photography was indeed invented in the 19th century, and he says as soon as that happened, the history of painting starts to change. The 19th century is when you start getting these modernist and pre-modernist modes of painting. That is, modes of painting that start to look like they're no longer trying to resemble, in a kind of Renaissance fashion, the things that they depict. Think about Impressionism, right? Impressionism is actually obscuring the detail and perspective of the things it depicts. Think about things like Cubism, Fauvism. If anyone studies art history, the 19th and 20th centuries are rampant with all these modes of going away from pictorial realism. Bazin thinks that the introduction of photography may have something to do with this. He thinks it's not just a coincidence, that as soon as you get a medium in which it's easy to resemble things, then resemblance stops becoming a privileged aim. So he says, photography completely satisfies our appetite for illusion by means of a process of mechanical reproduction in which there is no human agency at work. The automatic way in which photographs are produced has radically transformed the psychology of the image. So notice here, he's answering the question, Bazin, why would photography satisfy our appetite for illusion? He says, because they're produced mechanically. And you might say, what do you mean by reproduced mechanically? And he'll say, they're produced in such a way in which human agency is not the sole means of achieving that illusion. In other words, there's something automatic about their ability to create. So what is automatic about photography? But the idea is that there is a combination of light and a camera, which basically is a device for receiving light. Light bounces off the subject, enters the aperture of the camera, and then touches a photochemical surface known as film. It goes through a series of chemical processes until you have an image. Now, I don't need to go through the details, but the idea is, even if you don't know how this works, you have the impression of understanding how photography works, that somehow the light itself is the author of the image. Yes, we make all of these choices, that is, us photographers, in how we choose to depict our subjects, but there is always some aspect of the image that we are not responsible for. That is, we seem to think as if, given how these things are made, the light itself is the author or the artist. So for the first time, the only thing to come between an object and its representation is another object. What does he mean by that? Well, here's your object, your apple. Here's your other object. I think this is what he means, the other object being the camera. And then here is the representation. Now, of course, when he's saying the only thing to come between an object and its representation is another object, he's exaggerating. Why? Because who is it that decides to take the picture from this angle as opposed to that one? That's, of course, me, the photographer, who's always making choices, but he's trying to exaggerate the role that this machine makes in producing basically an image that looks a hell of a lot like the original object. He'll elaborate. The photographer's personality is at work only in the selection, orientation, and pedagogical approach to the phenomenon. So here he's saying, no, I'm not naive. I know that photographers make choices. And he says it, right? Bazin is really good at saying something broad, and you going, wait a minute, you're wrong. And then he'll say like, no, I know. So he does that here. He says, as evident as his personality may be in the final product, it is not present in the same way as a painter's. He's saying, okay. Photographers do indeed insert their subjectivity, their expression into a photograph. But it is very, very different from the way a painter does it. Photography's objectivity confers upon it a degree of credibility absent from any painting. And I think this is the paragraph, 3 or 4 sentences long, that really gets to the essence of what he's arguing. In other words, it explains this claim that there is such a thing called photography's objectivity. Like, what is the nature of photography's objectivity? That's kind of one of the ways of putting the question of the article. So let's go through it sentence by sentence. First, only the photographic lens gives us an image of the object that is capable of relieving out of the depths of our unconscious our need to substitute for the object something more than an approximation. What does he mean by that? Well, here's the object itself, and there's the approximation, and then we're disappointed by the gap between these two things, right? It's a very impressive painting of this apple, let's say it were, but it's not as close as I imagine it could be, right? Then he'll say that something is the object itself, but liberated from its temporal contingencies. So what does he mean? Here's the object itself. Here's a photograph of the object itself. Temporal contingencies is just a fancy way of saying the fact that this object, because it is an object in the world, whose conditions are, say, that there are space and time, will always change, right? That its existence is contingent upon the things that may happen to it in time. For example, me deciding to cut the apple into slices, or if the apple was just left alone to its own devices, the fact that the apple would eventually rot. In other words, what he's saying is that a photograph preserves some essence of that object as if it is made independent of the contingencies of time. This might seem like obvious to you. Yes, that's what a photograph is, but he's trying to put it in such a way that you discover something magical, right? Something quite special about this medium that you take for granted, because we live with photography. It's part of our lives, right? We don't think about it as a very special kind of medium in the history of image making. And that's what his essay is trying to do. Third sentence, the image may be out of focus, distorted, devoid of color, and without documentary value. Nevertheless, it has been created out of the ontology of the model. I think this is maybe the most important sentence of the entire essay. And if we understand it, we can understand a hell of a lot of what he's trying to say. Here's one way of understanding what he's trying to say. Here's the model, which is another way of saying the object itself. Here's the photograph of the model. Now, I've reproduced the photograph in such a way that it looks fuzzy and distorted, right? It looks as if it doesn't have the strongest resemblance qualities that it could, and yet it still retains something. So his question is, when you have this fuzzy, distorted photograph of the model, what is it that it contains of the original thing if the resemblance to that original thing has been decreased by virtue of, say, an out-of-focus camera? He's saying it still contains the ontology of the model. Another way of saying it contains the very being of the model. That's what he's saying. What he means by that is still something that we don't quite know. So we'll get to that in a minute. But that's what he's trying to say. Further version or a kind of subsidiary claim he'll make later is the most faithful drawing can give us more information about the model, maybe more visual information. But it will never, no matter what our critical faculties tell us, possess the irrational power of photography in which we believe without reservation. So we could put it this way, that, hey, some paintings actually might have more visual information that makes the painting resemble the apple, but it lacks something else. So we might say this painting here, if we call this a painting of the apple, has more resemblance to the apple than this does, but this has what? More ontology, more of the apple's being. That's the question he's trying to answer. What does it have more of if it has less visual information than the painting does, right? And then the final sentence is like this mysterious, almost nonsensical claim. He'll say, it's not just created out of the ontology of the model, it is the model. What the hell could he mean by that? If you read this seriously, and I kind of want you to take his words seriously, you should react negatively to this, or you should say that this seems like nonsense. So I have actually I've included an image of a reaction from Aristotle. Aristotle, who is a very careful philosopher, who insists that A equals A and B equals B, and you can't have it any other way. So we might say clearly the photograph of the apple isn't the apple itself, like the law of identity says so. The law of identity is that A is A. What could you possibly mean by it is the model, right? You have the model, that is the original apple, and the photograph of the apple. They're clearly different things. So let's actually be generous. What could he mean if he's not just being nonsensical? Maybe the being of the apple just is the light that it reflects. So he's thinking about these kind of deep questions in a way about what is a thing, right? So maybe if we're going to be skeptical about our ability to know the outside world, we might just say, if I can't, say, access the apple outside of my own faculty of perception, that gives me visual access to the apple, maybe the apple just is the light that it reflects. So in some sense, maybe the photograph of the apple and the apple itself, both of which are created out of the light that reflects the apple, maybe they are in some sense identical, right? And that's the sense that he's trying to articulate, right? Seems like a nonsensical claim. Maybe it has some sense to it. And you can actually see other sentences in the essay that might elaborate on this. He'll say, photography transfers reality from the object depicted to its reproduction. That's a really interesting phrase, that it transfers the object's reality from the object itself to its reproduction, right? He's using these sentences that are trying to defamiliarize the very thing that photography is, right? That's what he's trying to do here. But what I want to do is actually dwell a little bit less on the philosophical claims that seem that we need to take a philosophy class to understand their merit, and actually dwell on this sentence, the one I told you that I think is the most important sentence of the whole thing. If he's saying the image may be out of focus, nevertheless, it has been created out of the ontology of the model. In other words, if the image lacks iconic value, it still has maybe indexical value. So what do I mean by index? Well, I'm actually invoking this philosopher's three categories of signs. The philosopher is an American pragmatist philosopher named C.S. Peirce. He became very important in later film theory for people trying to understand early accounts of what photography was. Index is a kind of sign that shows evidence for the existence of what it refers to, like a footprint, like a weather vane, or like a bullet hole. Think of those individual things that we encounter as signs. And what is a sign? A sign is just anything that stands in for something else that isn't there, right? Like the word tree stands in for this idea of tree. And I can tell you the word tree without having trees nearby to point to. Index is a kind of sign that points to or shows the evidence for the existence of a particular material thing that was there in the world, like the foot that was there, that I assume to be there if I see its footprint. The icon is probably the kind of sign we're most familiar with. An icon is a thing that has a physical resemblance to the thing that's being presented. A figurative painting, or a painting in which you recognize particular things, like the Mona Lisa, is not a photograph of a woman. It is a representation or an iconic sign of a woman that we're calling Mona Lisa. And a symbol is a kind of sign that doesn't have a resemblance to a thing in the world. It has no resemblance between the signifier and the signified. The connection between them must be culturally learned. What's a great example of a symbolic sign? Words. Remember that tree I mentioned earlier? Think about the word tree, both in its visual form as T, R, E, and E, or in its heard form, the sound tree, or if you speak Spanish, arbol. Think about all the languages in which a particular sound stands in for that thing that has bark and has leaves and that flows in the wind. The sound tree has no resemblance to that thing out there. It doesn't have the same connection to that thing out there that a painting of a tree does. That's why we call it symbolic. It's an artificial, or rather it's an arbitrary relationship to the thing. What is the index? Once again, think of indexicality as the relationship, or as the tension between my, say, a sketch of my thumb and a thumbprint. Let's say, what is the difference between how each of these things represent my thumb, right? Let's say I drew this picture of my hand with my thumb here, and let's say I put my thumb in ink and then put it on paper. It's really this image that, while it doesn't resemble my thumb, testifies to the existence of my thumb in a way that this drawing does not. It only resembles my thumb. It does not testify to the existence of my thumb, especially if somebody else drew it. So, and Bazin will actually use the fingerprint as an example. The existence of a photographed object shares in the existence of the model, like a fingerprint. It's sentences like these that led film theorists in the 60s and 70s and 80s to say, oh, maybe Bazin is actually thinking of the index, which was a concept from C.S. Peirce. And once again, what is iconicity? Iconicity is the quality of resemblance. So in this meme picture from the internet, which I like quite a bit, it's basically giving us an iconicity increase from left to right. This resembles a horse. This only abstractly and almost pathetically does so. Iconicity goes from left to right, up. So remember that a photograph is a kind of object that yokes together icon and index, right? Yes, we're talking about the index. And yes, for Bazin, the index is the thing that he really wants you to fixate on, almost to the detriment of your appreciation for its iconic qualities. So one of the questions I want you to think about as we move forward with Bazin and even move on to the next text in Bazin's work is, how do we keep the indexical qualities of cinematic and photographic images in mind when we're watching fiction films not to be used as documents of past realities, but as fictional works of art? How does a filmmaker use the indexical qualities of the medium to create particular aesthetic effects? And perhaps a question related more to our film for this week, Waltz with Bashir: what are the ways in which the indexical qualities of the photographic image are not the same as something we might call truth or reality?